Sir, you'll need to move to economy. This seat is reserved for someone important. That's what they told him. Loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Calm enough to sound like policy. But clear enough to know exactly what they meant. You don't belong here because of the color of your skin. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply looked up from his seat in 2B, the seat he paid for, and asked one question. Why me? The answer came with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Sometimes image matters. And just like that, a black man in a quiet coat became a problem. Not because he did anything wrong, but because someone else wanted the seat, and the crew decided he was the one who didn't fit the image of business class. No one knew who he was. Not yet. This isn't just about an airline. It's about how prejudice hides behind polite voices. About what happens when quiet power refuses to shrink. And about the moment a silent man reveals the truth and flips the entire cabin upside down. Before we show you what happened when the plane touched down, hit that like button if you believe respect should never depend on appearance. Subscribe for more stories that expose the quiet war beneath everyday life. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what would you have done if you were sitting in row 2B? Because what's coming next? It will make you question everything. The airport was humming with its usual morning chaos. Rolling luggage wheels, boarding calls echoing over the intercom, sleepy passengers sipping bitter coffee while scanning departure screens. In the midst of it all, a man in a plain brown overcoat stepped into the business class check-in area. He looked like he had come from a long journey, or perhaps a quiet retreat. His shoes were polished but old. His scarf was neatly folded but worn. He wore a hat pulled low and sunglasses that concealed his eyes, but nothing about him screamed wealth or power. In fact, most of the staff didn't look at him twice, except for the agent at the business class counter. "Sir," the young woman behind the counter said with a raised eyebrow as he approached. Her voice was courteous, but something in her tone hinted at suspicion. "I think you may be in the wrong line. Economy check-in is just down that way." She gestured with a clipboard, her smile forced. The man paused for a second. His lips curled into a soft, understanding smile. He didn't correct her, at least not yet. Instead, he simply reached into his coat and pulled out a black leather wallet, slowly unfolding a sleek boarding pass. She took it, scanned it, and her smile faltered as the terminal beeped. "Business class seat 2B. "Oh," she murmured. "I see." No apology, just a slightly more neutral tone as she printed his baggage tag. As he walked away, dragging a modest leather suitcase behind him, she whispered something to her colleague, who laughed under his breath. Neither of them knew who he was. That was how he preferred it. As the man moved toward the priority security lane, another attendant, taller, older, and more experienced, intercepted him with a quick glance at his boarding pass. "Sir, this is for priority access. Do you have confirmation for this tier?" The man didn't flinch. He handed over the pass again, and this time added, "Yes, I do." The attendant scanned the code, frowned slightly, and motioned him forward without another word. The man proceeded, calm as ever, barely breaking stride. But behind him, a brief exchange of puzzled glances took place among the staff. In the waiting lounge, the man found a quiet seat near a window. He sat down with the poise of someone used to waiting. A mother nearby tried to hush her crying child. A businessman argued loudly over Bluetooth. A young couple took selfies in front of the terminal map. But he sat still, back straight, hands folded, observing but not reacting. Occasionally, his eyes would drift to the tarmac, where a soft morning light was breaking over the wing of the plane he'd soon board. Across the room, Madeline Cross, the lead flight attendant for the upcoming international flight, walked through the lounge, reviewing her passenger list. Blonde, poised, with the precision of someone who had worked in luxury aviation for over 15 years, she scanned the list with a mental image of the kind of clientele she expected. CEOs, influencers, dignitaries who looked the part. As she glanced up, her eyes settled momentarily on the man in the brown coat. She squinted, subtly sizing him up from across the room, then looked back at her list with a frown. Moments later, A buzz ran through the staff's internal radio. A last-minute addition. Mr. Gregory Lang, international investment mogul and platinum partner with the airline, would be boarding business class. His assistant had already called to ensure everything would be in order. Madeline clicked her earpiece. "Copy that," she said, turning sharply toward the gate. "We'll make it happen." She didn't yet know the ripple that request would cause. As boarding began, the man in brown rose from his seat and merged into the boarding queue, though not into the economy line. He stepped into the business class lane, scanned his pass, and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, he nodded courteously to the first flight attendant, who barely noticed him. He took a seat, 2B by the window, placed his coat neatly above in the bin, and sat with a quiet sigh, adjusting his glasses. Other passengers began to board, each greeted by Madeline or her staff with practiced hospitality. She smiled brightly at a tech billionaire, offered champagne to a famous actor, even helped an elderly woman settle in. But when her eyes landed on 2B, when she saw the man in the coat, her smile didn't reach her eyes. Her expression flickered with uncertainty, maybe even disdain. She leaned toward one of her colleagues and whispered, "Do you know who that is?" The other shrugged. "Probably a mistake." Madeline walked down the aisle, paused at 2B, and tilted her head. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Her voice was smooth, polite, but firm. The man looked up, handed her the same ticket he'd shown twice before. She examined it. 2B business class. No flags. No errors. Still, she hesitated. "Thank you," she said, but the stiffness in her posture lingered as she walked back toward the galley. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his role. But something about him didn't sit right with her, perhaps because she had already decided what kind of people belonged in the seats up front. This man did not fit her mental picture of success. In the cockpit, the captain and first officer reviewed the flight manifest. No one mentioned anything unusual. Just another international route. Just another roster of high-value passengers. But outside the cabin, between boarding zones and boarding passes, something had already begun unraveling. A seed of discomfort was growing, and by the time the cabin doors closed, it would have turned into a storm of assumptions, entitlement, and one man's unshakable dignity. The engines hummed softly beneath the cabin floor as the aircraft filled with a quiet bustle of boarding passengers. Elias Monroe sat in seat 2B, a window seat tucked neatly in the first row of the business class section. He had settled in with the same calm as he had displayed throughout the terminal. His coat was folded across his lap, his hands rested gently on the armrests, and his gaze drifted outside where the morning sun now glinted off the airplane's wing. He had said little, drawn no attention, and for all intents and purposes, looked like just another reserved traveler. But even as the cabin doors remained open and the overhead bins clicked shut one by one, the tension in the air was rising, subtle but undeniable. Madeline Cross strode through the cabin with the silent confidence of someone who had long considered it her domain. She had worked on more flights than she could count, from private charters to transatlantic runs, and she prided herself on maintaining a very specific kind of order. An order that, to her, meant elegance, consistency, and a clientele that looked the part. She held a folded tablet in one hand and wore a smile that could switch between warmth and frost with alarming precision. As she approached row 2, her smile began to shift. She paused directly beside seat 2B. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice polished but unmistakably firm. Elias turned slowly to look up at her, expression unreadable, composed. "Yes," he replied quietly. She returned a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm terribly sorry, but it seems there's been an issue with your seat assignment. Would you mind letting me take another look at your boarding pass?" Elias didn't protest. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, retrieved the slim pass, and handed it to her. She took it, glanced at the name, then at the seat number. Her eyes flicked from the pass back to Elias, then again to the tablet she carried. A pause, then another smile. "Thank you," she said, before adding, "There's a very important passenger joining us, a partner with the airline. We're trying to accommodate him, and unfortunately, that may require a slight adjustment." Would you be open to switching seats? Her tone remained civil, even sweet, but the language, a very important passenger, carried with it the same weight as a velvet glove shove. Elias took the pass back without looking at it. "What kind of adjustment?" he asked. "Well," Madeline said, a step closer now, "we'd like to move you to another available seat further back in the cabin. You would, of course, be compensated accordingly." "Further back," Elias repeated slowly, as if tasting the phrase. "And why me?" Madeline's smile twitched, her professionalism strained, but intact. "Oh, no specific reason," she said with airy dismissiveness. "We just try to match passengers with comfort and presentation. Sometimes image matters in the front row of business class, especially when we have guests of particular significance." There it was, not shouted, not spat, but offered with that gentle cruelty only polished prejudice could muster. Elias studied her, silent for a moment, then said, "And you're asking this of how many passengers?" Madeline's posture stiffened. "It's just a small courtesy, we hope you'll understand," she said. "We wouldn't ask if it weren't important." "I'm sure," Elias replied, voice still calm, but carrying a tone that was now far more pointed than polite. He adjusted his glasses and turned back toward the window, as if to resume his view of the tarmac. Madeline lingered a second too long, sensing she hadn't won the exchange. She was used to compliance, especially from those she assumed wouldn't dare push back. But Elias wasn't reacting the way she expected. There was no indignation, no pleading, not even offense. Only stillness, and that somehow disturbed her more. Behind her, the rest of the business class passengers continued to board. Gregory Lang, the man she had referred to, the one who had requested preferential boarding, and who had made it clear his presence should be prioritized, was moments from arriving. Madeline knew this, and the pressure of time, image, and expectation began to press against her carefully curated smile. Joseph, the junior attendant, approached from behind her with a discreet murmur. "The VIP is at the gate. They're waiting for a go." Madeline nodded, without turning. "Give me 2 minutes." Then, back to Elias, she leaned in just slightly. "Sir, I'm asking again, with full respect, could we move you to 8C? It's still business class, just not in the premium section." Elias exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but perhaps to test her patience. 8C, he repeated. "And if I decline?" Madeline's smile thinned. "We'll have to consider other options. But I'd rather not escalate anything. It's a simple request. Nothing more." A pause. Elias turned to face her, and for the first time, his gaze truly settled on hers. There was no heat in it, no accusation, but something in its stead. A weight, a gravity that made her suddenly uncertain of where she stood or what authority she truly had in that moment. "I'll remain in my seat," he said clearly. And with that, he returned his gaze to the window, not waiting for her response. Madeline stood there frozen, caught between policy and pride. Her mind raced. She could escalate to the captain. She could try another angle. But something in her gut whispered that this was no ordinary passenger. Still, her training kicked in, pushing her to preserve face. She turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the front of the plane, muttering to herself under her breath, "Image matters." She opened the cabin door just slightly and called to Joseph, "Bring the tablet. And tell Lang we're finalizing seating. I'll handle this." In seat 2B, Elias adjusted his coat once more, his fingers moving with quiet rhythm across the fabric. He didn't glance back, didn't shift in his seat. He had been through this before, not on planes perhaps, but in rooms with colder air and sharper words. He knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The plane hadn't left the ground, and already the turbulence had begun. Elias remained in seat 2B, posture relaxed, eyes out the window, but his awareness sharpened with every passing moment. He had felt this kind of tension before, not loud, not obvious, but present like a low hum beneath the surface of civility. The kind that didn't push you, but pressed on you in calculated silence. As the remaining passengers settled in, the usual symphony of small talk and polite service echoed through the business class cabin. Madeline had retreated to the galley, speaking in hushed tones with Joseph and another flight attendant about adjusting presentation, but Elias had heard enough. He didn't need eavesdropping to understand the hierarchy at play. It was etched into every glance, every pause in conversation, every deliberate omission. The service cart rolled down the aisle, led by Joseph, who now looked slightly uncomfortable. He was polite, professional, but when his eyes flicked toward Elias, there was hesitation. Madeline had clearly spoken to him. Joseph stopped at seat 2A, smiled at the gentleman seated there, and offered a menu of options: orange juice, champagne, sparkling water. The man selected a glass of Merlot and laughed at something Joseph said. Then Joseph moved to seat 2C and did the same. But when he reached 2B, he didn't stop. He rolled the cart forward without making eye contact. Elias turned his head slowly, calmly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle but precise. "Water, please." Joseph hesitated mid-step. He turned, eyes flicking toward the galley where Madeline stood watching. "I'm sorry, sir," Joseph said, attempting a neutral tone. "I was told we're still verifying your seat assignment. We'll serve you once that's confirmed." He moved the cart on before Elias could respond. Elias said nothing. His eyes followed the cart as it continued down the aisle, stopping for everyone else without question. A few passengers noticed, though most pretended not to. 2 rows back, a woman paused with her tablet mid-air, her brow furrowing slightly. Across the aisle, a man lowered his newspaper just enough to glance at Elias, then raised it again as if the act of looking too long might implicate him in something uncomfortable. It was subtle, but deliberate. Everyone around him sipped wine or adjusted napkins while Elias sat, hands folded, as if the absence of a drink tray was the only thing setting him apart. The man in 2A, who had earlier enjoyed a casual exchange with Joseph, now leaned slightly toward Elias. He was in his late 50s, wore a tailored navy suit and a thick gold watch, and spoke with the breezy condescension of someone used to being heard. "First time flying up here?" he asked, tone light but loaded. Elias turned his head with a slight nod. "Not quite," he replied. The man chuckled. "Huh, must be a lottery seat, then. No offense, but you don't exactly strike me as corporate travel." His smile didn't fade as he said it. Elias smiled back, not wide, just enough. "No offense taken," he said, though the weight behind his eyes said otherwise. The man took another sip of wine and turned away, satisfied with what he assumed was a harmless jab. To him, it was a joke. To Elias, it was confirmation. The moments stretched. Flight attendants moved fluidly through the aisles, offering towels, adjusting pillows, setting down menus, but none returned to 2B. Elias remained untouched, as if the space around him carried a quiet contagion no one wanted to acknowledge. He watched their movements like a man reading a dance he'd memorized long ago. It was all routine, rehearsed, and it had nothing to do with process. It had to do with presumption. They didn't question his presence because of a mistake. They questioned it because of an assumption, and no policy could mask that. At the front of the cabin, Madeline spoke to Gregory Lang, the VIP whose arrival had triggered the whole chain of events. Lang, tall and silver-haired, entered the aircraft like a man entering a gala. He spoke with the confidence of someone who was always expected. Madeline smiled at him in a way she hadn't smiled at anyone else. She leaned close, laughed lightly, offered him champagne before he even sat down. Gregory glanced around the cabin and, seeing Elias in 2B, raised an eyebrow. "Bit of a mix this time," he muttered under his breath. Madeline tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "We're addressing it," she whispered. Gregory settled into 2A and gave Elias a nod that was barely a nod at all. "Morning," he said, but didn't wait for a reply. Instead, he turned back to Madeline. "So about the seating issue?" She hesitated, visibly torn between avoiding confrontation and protecting the airline's partnerships. "We're still working on it," she replied. But he declined to move. Gregory smirked. "Declined? That's cute." Behind them, Joseph reappeared, carrying a tray of drinks. He walked down the aisle with slightly faster steps now, avoiding Elias's row entirely. But as he passed, Elias looked up again. Still unverified? He asked quietly. Joseph stopped, face tightening. I'll check again with the lead, he said, and disappeared toward the galley. Madeline caught him at the curtain. I told you, she snapped, low and clipped. Do not serve him until I say so. Joseph hesitated. He's not doing anything wrong, he said, but Madeline's glare silenced him. This isn't about wrong. It's about consistency, visual cohesion. We're hosting Gregory Lang today. We don't need confusion in the premium row. Joseph nodded reluctantly. As he walked away, Madeline exhaled sharply and turned back toward the cabin. Elias still sat in 2B, unmoving, unbothered on the surface, but watching, always watching. His stillness had begun to feel like pressure, the kind that built slowly, methodically, without ever breaking stride. A flight attendant placed a meal selection menu at 2A, then at 2C, skip 2B. Again. This time, even a few passengers noticed. One murmured, he hasn't gotten anything. Another said, maybe he's fasting. But they all fell silent when Madeline passed by again, checking on Gregory with almost performative elegance. No one said it, but the message had been delivered and received. You don't belong here. Not because of your ticket, but because of who they thought you were. And they were so certain of who they thought that was, they didn't even feel the need to ask. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as final preparations for takeoff continued, casting soft shadows across the business class section. Elias remained in seat 2B, his hands calmly resting on his lap, while around him the hum of last-minute chatter and crew movement filled the air. The service had resumed in full for every other passenger. Linen napkins were placed, welcome drinks refilled, flight attendants passed back and forth with practiced efficiency. Yet none approached 2B. The silence around him had thickened, not in volume but in atmosphere. The absence of attention had become a statement of its own. That kind of isolation was something Elias had learned to recognize long before this flight. Still, he said nothing. Madeline Cross, now moving up and down the aisle like a conductor of stage civility, passed by Elias's seat for the third time in less than 10 minutes. Each time, she moved quickly, pretending to check overhead compartments or straighten headrest covers. But what stood out wasn't what she did, it was how she did it. On her first pass, her hip brushed Elias's shoulder slightly. She offered a brief, mechanical, "Excuse me, it's a bit tight here," and continued without pause. The second time, it was her elbow, sharper and more deliberate, pressing into his armrest as she leaned toward a neighboring seat. "Pardon the space, sir," she said, again without eye contact, before gliding on. The third time, she dropped a napkin beside his leg, reached down to retrieve it with an exaggerated sigh, and bumped his knee with her forearm. "Oh, these aisles," she muttered, each incident subtle, deniable, but calculated. Elias didn't flinch, not once. His eyes followed her only briefly, then returned to the closed window beside him, where clouds drifted far below, untouched by the politics of proximity. From across the aisle, a woman in her early 40s watched quietly. She wore a pearl necklace and an expensive cream blazer, and her lips tightened as she observed Madeline's awkward ballet around seat 2B. She didn't say anything, just stared for a moment too long before returning her gaze to her tablet. Meanwhile, the passenger in 2C, a younger man with slicked back hair and a Rolex that gleamed beneath the cabin lights, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been watching Elias out of the corner of his eye for some time, clearly unsure how to feel about the unusual dynamics in his row. After Madeline's third accidental bump, the man in 2C pressed the call button. A soft chime echoed. Joseph approached quickly. "Yes, sir," he asked. The man leaned closer, lowered his voice slightly, but not enough that Elias couldn't hear. "Look, I don't mean to cause trouble, but I'm feeling a little uneasy. Is there any way I can switch seats?" Joseph blinked. "Is there a problem with your seat, sir?" The man hesitated, then glanced sideways toward Elias. "It's just, I'm not sure I feel comfortable here. No offense." Joseph's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. "I understand. Let me check what's available." Joseph stepped away, tablet in hand. Elias didn't move. He didn't turn to the man. He simply sat, letting the words hang in the air. It wasn't the first time he'd heard variations of the same sentiment, couched in politeness, masked as preference, but rooted in fear of difference. He didn't even blink. Madeline returned moments later, this time smiling far too brightly. "Mr. Leary," she said to the man in 2C, "we've arranged another seat for you in row 5. It's a window and a bit more private." Leary nodded, already unbuckling. "Appreciate it." Madeline glanced once at Elias as the man stood and gathered his bag. "We just want all our passengers to feel safe and comfortable," she said, loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. Joseph stood nearby, watching the exchange with a look that blended disapproval and quiet helplessness. The moment the man left, the space beside Elias remained empty. No replacement passenger, no explanation, just a vacant seat that now seemed to isolate him even further, like a line drawn around his presence, separating him from the others. As Madeline passed by once more, she didn't bump him this time, but she paused beside him, adjusted her posture, and said in a soft but pointed voice, "We do apologize if the cabin feels a bit disorganized today. It's always a challenge accommodating last-minute changes." Elias didn't respond. He simply looked at her, not angrily, not even coldly, just a steady, unwavering gaze that seemed to peel back the politeness she wore like armor. She turned away quickly. The ripple effect of the seat change began to settle over the cabin. Conversations quieted. A few more passengers now looked toward Elias, not openly, but with sidelong glances, whispers, curious stares. Some looked away when he met their gaze. Others didn't bother. It was the kind of attention no one wanted to admit they were giving, the kind reserved for those they couldn't quite categorize. Elias, still without a drink, a meal, or a word of apology, remained the calmest figure in the room. But it wasn't peace. It was patience. Joseph, walking past again, glanced down and stopped. "Would you like some water now, sir?" he asked softly. Elias looked up. "Have we confirmed my seat yet?" Joseph hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. "It was never unconfirmed," he replied quietly. Elias's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Then, yes, water would be appreciated. Joseph returned a moment later with a chilled bottle and a glass, placing them gently on the tray table. "If there's anything else," he began, but Elias held up a hand. "You've done enough." Not accusatory, just final. The aisle beside 2B grew quiet again. The seat at 2C remained empty. The air had shifted. There was no more laughter in the nearby rows, no idle gossip. Only silence and tension. Elias drank slowly, staring straight ahead. The ice in the glass clinked once, and then all was still. The soft murmur of cruising altitude comfort settled over the cabin as the plane stabilized in the sky, but the stillness around seat 2B remained thick, almost brittle. The tension hadn't faded. It had simply disguised itself in silence, one that felt heavier with each passing minute. Elias Monroe sipped from his glass of water slowly, the ice now nearly melted, and his gaze was steady on the closed window shade beside him. The vacant seat at 2C stood as a quiet monument to everything that had already happened. The rest of the business class passengers had returned to their books, their tablets, their wine, but their awareness of Elias hadn't gone anywhere. If anything, it had deepened, now laced with subtle discomfort, the kind that no one dared speak aloud. From a galley, Joseph moved quietly, hands occupied with silverware and folded linen, but his mind elsewhere. He stole another glance toward seat 2B and furrowed his brow. There was something about the man's posture, his silence, his unbothered presence amidst all the subtle hostility that didn't align with Joseph's experience of passengers who were out of place. Normally, those who stumbled into business class by error, luck, or upgrade either fidgeted, overcompensated, or shrank into their seat. Elias did none of that. He didn't appear bothered, embarrassed, nor defensive. In fact, his stillness had a sort of gravity to it, one that subtly shifted the mood of the entire row without effort. Joseph reached for a tray, but paused as his memory tugged at him. Specifically, a fleeting image from a televised diplomatic event several months earlier, one he'd caught while delivering meals on another flight. The image was faint but persistent, A formal setting, dignitaries in dark suits, golden banners and national crests. A long table filled with glasses that sparkled under chandelier light. Among the gathered world leaders, there had been a man standing slightly back, hands clasped, expression composed. A man who didn't need to speak to command the room. That man had looked almost exactly like Elias. Joseph's fingers tightened around the tray. Could it be? The resemblance was uncanny. And now that he thought about it, the poise, the refusal to argue, the way Elias responded not with protest, but with disarming quiet, it all added up. He didn't wear power on his sleeve, but it clung to him nonetheless. Joseph glanced back down the aisle toward the cockpit, where the captain and Madeline were speaking in hushed tones. He debated whether to say something, but thought better of it. Instead, he walked down the aisle again, this time slower, more deliberate, and stopped beside 2B. Elias looked up, his face neutral but alert. Joseph cleared his throat, his voice low and casual. "Sir, forgive me for asking, but have we met before?" Elias studied him for a moment, his gaze searching but kind. "I don't believe so," he replied. "Why do you ask?" Joseph hesitated. "I think I may have seen you somewhere. On television, maybe. A global summit or something official." He stopped short of naming specifics, uncertain how far to go. Elias smiled, not a wide smile, not performative, just the soft arch of someone who wasn't surprised. "I've stood next to a few important people," he said quietly. That might be it. The sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. It wasn't a denial, but it wasn't confirmation either. Just enough truth to provoke thought, just enough ambiguity to keep the mystery alive. Joseph blinked, nodded, and offered a faint smile. "Of course," he said, his tone almost reverent now. "Well, let me know if you need anything." "Thank you," Elias replied simply, and returned to his seat as if the conversation had never happened. Joseph moved away, heart thudding slightly, mind racing. He replayed the words in his head, "I've stood next to a few important people," and tried to recall the image again from the summit broadcast. The suit, the quiet presence, the subtle authority that didn't ask for the spotlight, but still owned it. It was him. Or, at least, it had to be someone like him. Joseph didn't know exactly what Elias Monroe's role might be, but he was now almost certain that the man sitting in 2B was no ordinary traveler. As Joseph returned to the galley, Madeline caught sight of him. "What were you doing at 2B?" she asked, arms crossed. "Just checking in," he said, making sure he was all right. Madeline rolled her eyes. "There's no need to encourage him. He's made it clear he wants to sit where he doesn't belong." Joseph stared at her for a moment, something shifting in his expression. "And what makes you so sure he doesn't belong there?" She blinked, surprised by the pushback. "Look at him," she said with a whisper, as if that explained everything. "He doesn't even have a carry-on, he hasn't ordered anything but water, he hasn't spoken to anyone. Or maybe," Joseph interrupted, "he doesn't feel welcome enough to ask for anything." Madeline narrowed her eyes. "Don't get sentimental, Joseph. We have protocol for a reason." Joseph didn't argue further. Instead, he stepped aside and checked the overhead inventory again, but inside, a quiet fire had lit. He wasn't entirely sure of Elias's identity, but something told him this flight would not end like any other. And something told him that Madeline was about to be very, very wrong. Meanwhile, Elias adjusted in his seat, uncrossing his legs, folding his hands again in his lap. His expression betrayed nothing, but in the faint movement of his shoulders, there was the rhythm of someone who was waiting, not for vindication, but for time. He had let people judge him before. He had let rooms shrink in his presence, because no one dared admit they misunderstood the man they were watching. He could wait a little longer. Patience was power too. The hum of the engines was steady, a low, soothing backdrop that contrasted sharply with the quiet storm building inside the aircraft. Elias Monroe remained in seat 2B, unmoved, composed, while the atmosphere around him thickened with each passing minute. His conversation with Joseph had ended hours ago, but its ripple effect had not. From the galley, Joseph stole glances toward Elias's seat, his expression increasingly troubled. Meanwhile, Madeline Cross was growing restless. Her fingers drummed impatiently on the metal service tray, her thoughts spinning not just with irritation, but with a rising sense of losing control. The man in 2B hadn't raised his voice, hadn't broken any rules, hadn't even made a formal complaint. Yet his quiet defiance, refusing to move, refusing to disappear, felt like an affront she could not let stand. That refusal echoed in her every step, in every unacknowledged drink order and subtle sidestep from other passengers. She could feel it tightening around her neck, like a silk scarf drawn just a little too taut. She checked the time, then tapped her earpiece. "Captain Harris, this is Madeline in business. I need to speak with you privately," she said, her voice controlled but tense. A pause, then the calm voice of the captain replied, "Go ahead, Madeline." She lowered her tone and stepped toward the bulkhead. "Seat 2B is causing complications. He's non-compliant, refused a reassignment request. He's been passive-aggressive with crew and has made other passengers uncomfortable." She paused for emphasis, then added with just enough weight, "He may be a security risk." The words hung in the air. There had been no threats, no aggression, no real disruption. But Madeline knew which phrases would trigger concern. Captain Harris responded after a beat of silence. "Is he being confrontational?" "Not outwardly," she admitted, "but he's been unwilling to cooperate, and there's been at least one seat relocation because of him." The captain sighed. "All right, let's not escalate in flight. I'll contact ground and arrange for a team to meet us at the gate. Let's have someone ready just in case." "Understood," Madeline said, a flicker of victory crossing her face. "I'll make sure we're prepared." At the front of the cockpit, Captain Harris tapped into the encrypted comm system and sent a discreet message to ground control. "Request security presence upon arrival business class. Seat 2B potentially uncooperative passenger." The ground team acknowledged. "Copy that. Officer team will meet aircraft at arrival door." From that moment on, a quiet countdown began. No alarm sounded, no announcement was made, but below the floor of business class, a plan was already in motion. A man was about to be removed, discreetly but decisively. Madeline straightened her uniform and returned to the cabin, the lines of fatigue now replaced by a rehearsed calm. She passed Joseph near the galley. "The captain's informed ground control," she said softly. Joseph looked at her sharply. "What?" "Security will be waiting when we land," she added. "It's for the best." Joseph lowered his voice. "You called him a risk." "I called him non-compliant," Madeline snapped. "Which he is." Joseph opened his mouth, then closed it, stepping aside with a clenched jaw. Elias, unaware of the full extent of the conversation but far too experienced to miss the signs, watched as Madeline's demeanor shifted. She no longer avoided him. Instead, she passed by more frequently, her steps slower, her posture exaggeratedly polite. It wasn't kindness, it was strategy. She was managing optics, setting a stage. He had seen that performance before in boardrooms, in banquets, in places where silence screamed louder than words. He knew exactly what was coming. In seat 2A, Gregory Lang adjusted his cufflinks and turned slightly toward Elias, a smirk playing at the edge of his mouth. "Funny thing," he said with forced lightness, "these flights always reveal the pecking order eventually." Elias didn't reply. He simply looked ahead, as if Gregory wasn't even there. The silence made Gregory chuckle. "You're calm. That's good. Calm people get walked off planes more gently." Madeline heard this as she walked past and didn't correct it. In the rows behind, a handful of passengers began whispering. Word of a situation had reached a few ears, courtesy of an overheard comment from a junior attendant, or a glance too many from Madeline's tightened face. One passenger, the woman in the pearl necklace, leaned toward her husband and whispered, "They're going to escort someone off the plane." "Who?" "That man in 2B, I think. The one no one served." Her husband frowned. "For what? He hasn't done anything." "Exactly," she said, her voice dropping. "That's the part one don't like." Back in the cockpit, Captain Harris checked the ETA, 26 minutes to descent. The approach would be smooth, but the landing might not. He tapped again into ground comms, confirming security team for arrival gate. Ground replied, Confirmed. Team standing by. Will board immediately after door opens. Joseph stood in the galley, motionless, watching the cabin as if it were a stage about to erupt. He moved slowly toward 2B, bent down slightly, and said in a hushed voice, "Sir, I just want to let you know there will be people meeting the flight when we land." Elias turned to him with a knowing expression. "I expected as much," he said. "Thank you for telling me." Joseph swallowed. "They were told you were non-compliant." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" Joseph hesitated. "No, sir. You've been remarkable." Elias gave the faintest nod. "Then let's see what they do with that." The cabin prepared for descent. Tray tables were locked, seatbacks raised, seat belts clicked into place. Outside the windows, the earth curved slowly back into view beneath the sky, turning gold at the edges. The pilot announced their final approach with the practiced voice of someone who had done it thousands of times. But even his tone carried a tension that hadn't been there before. In 2B, Elias adjusted his cuffs, brushed imaginary dust from his knee, and sat back. His face was unreadable. Not resigned, not resistant, just steady. The plane dipped lower, its nose angling toward the runway as the landing gear engaged with a mechanical groan. Inside the cabin, the seatbelt signs blinked on, and passengers stirred with the quiet urgency that always arrived in the final descent. Bags were tucked under seats, heads craned toward windows, and conversations resumed in clipped, excited murmurs. But in row 2, the air was still thick with tension. Elias Monroe remained motionless in seat 2B, back straight, hands on armrests, eyes fixed ahead. Madeline paced with deliberate calm near the front galley, her thoughts sharpening like the edge of a knife. Joseph stood silently by the service station, arms crossed, unsure whether he was watching the end of something shameful or the beginning of something much larger. As the wheels touched the tarmac with a smooth, practiced thud, a collective exhale swept through the plane. The captain's voice crackled over the speaker, thanking passengers for choosing the airline and welcoming them to their destination. His tone, professional yet taut, as if aware of the tension brewing in the front rows. The plane rolled steadily toward the gate, passing rows of hangars, auxiliary vehicles, and blinking ground crews. But then something unusual caught the attention of passengers near the left windows. A small child pointed first, then a murmur spread from row to row. Outside, flanking the runway just beyond the terminal, was a line of dark armored vehicles. Sleek black SUVs, official sedans, and motorcycles formed a sharp, seamless convoy. Uniformed officers, dozens of them, stood at precise intervals, boots aligned. Eyes forward, posture unflinching. A ceremonial honor guard had formed just beyond the aircraft's taxi path, their gleaming dress uniforms shimmering in the sun. Behind them stood figures in tailored suits, flanked by flags, their presence unmistakably official. Passengers leaned closer to the windows. Someone gasped. "Is there a diplomat on board?" one woman asked. "A general?" whispered another. "Must be a CEO in 2A," muttered Gregory Lang smugly, straightening his tie and checking his cufflinks, as if preparing for a red carpet. "Told you this was going to be a high-profile visit." Madeline turned toward him with a tight smile. "You may be right, Mr. Lang," she said, glancing sideways at seat 2B with a flicker of satisfaction. She reached for the intercom handset, preparing for final procedures. The aircraft came to a stop. The engines quieted to a low, idle hum. The ground crew motioned for stair access instead of the usual jet bridge. An attendant opened the main cabin door with a hiss of pressure, and sunlight flooded the entrance. And then silence fell. A lone figure emerged from the convoy and ascended the mobile staircase with measured steps. He wore a deep navy dress uniform with polished boots, epaulets glinting under the light, and a black beret bearing a gold insignia. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the quiet intensity of a man who did not hesitate. Every step was crisp, every motion deliberate. He reached the threshold of the aircraft, nodded briefly to the flight crew, and entered the cabin without a word. All eyes turned toward him. The passengers fell silent, some holding their breath, others watching with fascination as the officer walked down the aisle, ignoring every seat until he stopped, dead center, in front of seat 2B. Madeline's breath caught, confusion flickering across her face. Gregory Lang leaned slightly forward, expecting a greeting, but the officer didn't even glance his way. Instead, he turned squarely to Elias, brought his hand sharply to his temple in a perfect military salute, and said with clear, unwavering authority, "Mr. President, welcome home." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the sound of lungs forgetting to exhale. Eyes widened, mouths parted in disbelief. Somewhere near row 5, someone muttered, "President," as if the word itself had been mistranslated. Elias looked up slowly, as though giving the moment permission to exist. He didn't rush. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once at the officer, then rose from his seat with the grace of someone not stepping into power, but reclaiming it. His movements were smooth, dignified, and deeply unsettling to those who had assumed otherwise. Madeline stood frozen at the front of the plane, her face pale, her lips slightly parted. Her posture wavered for the first time in hours. She turned her head toward Joseph, who did not return her look. He was staring directly at Elias, a flicker of vindication in his eyes. Gregory Lang coughed lightly, then rose halfway from his seat. "Mr. President?" he asked, a nervous chuckle in his voice, attempting familiarity. Elias paused, turned and met his gaze, not coldly, but without interest. "Mr. Lang," he said, his voice low and steady. "Good to see you." It wasn't a greeting. It was a dismissal wrapped in civility. Lang sat back down slowly, unsure what to do with his hands. The officer turned to Madeline. "We'll be escorting the president off first. Please ensure no one exits until the security team signals." Madeline opened her mouth, then closed it. She nodded mutely. The officer gave a sharp nod and stepped back, waiting. Elias adjusted his coat, picked up his small travel bag, one he had carried himself from the beginning, and began walking slowly toward the exit. He didn't speak. He didn't look around. But everyone on that plane now looked at him, not as a misplaced man in an expensive seat, but as the one man whose seat, whose silence, whose stillness had carried more weight than any uniform, any champagne, or any title they had ever assumed gave them superiority. Joseph stepped slightly to the side as Elias passed him. "Safe travels, sir," he said quietly. Elias turned his head just enough to meet his eyes. "Thank you," he said. Then he was gone, stepping into the blinding sunlight, where rows of soldiers snapped into perfect formation, and officers stood to attention like statues cast from discipline and pride. The president had returned, and for many on that plane, the world had just shifted on its axis. The air inside the cabin felt frozen in place, suspended in a vacuum of disbelief and unspoken regret. The moment the officer uttered the words, "Mr. President, welcome home," the plane's atmosphere underwent a transformation so complete that it rendered even the most vocal passengers mute. No more whispers, no more side glances, only the weight of realization crashing down like pressure at high altitude. As Elias Monroe stepped out of his seat, the subtle sound of his coat brushing against the leather echoed like a thunderclap. The act was simple, a man rising from a chair, but in context it was seismic. It was the unraveling of every assumption, every microaggression, every condescending smile that had painted the past 10 hours. He didn't rush. He didn't strut. He simply adjusted the collar of his coat with the same care he had folded it when he boarded, as though nothing extraordinary had happened, yet everything had changed. Madeline Cross, who had orchestrated this entire sequence of indignity, stood at the front of the cabin with her back straight, but her expression told another story. Her lips parted slightly, as if to form a word, perhaps an apology or an excuse, but none came. Her posture, previously poised and commanding, now held a stiffness born of internal collapse. Her training taught her how to control rooms, to direct energy, to maintain authority. But no training had prepared her for this moment. The realization that the man she had tried to minimize, push, and displace was, in fact, the most powerful individual on that plane, and perhaps the only one who had chosen restraint over retaliation. Elias reached the front of the aisle. Before descending the stairs, he turned his head slowly, not toward the applauding guards waiting outside, nor toward the sea of dumbstruck passengers, but toward Madeline. Their eyes met. No words passed between them. No gestures were made. But in that look, there was a weight no reprimand could carry, no lecture could capture. His gaze held neither rage nor pity. It held judgment, but not the kind that shamed. It was the kind that exposed. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. She didn't look away, but something inside her shifted like glass cracking under pressure. Elias didn't linger. He gave her no lecture, no final word. He simply turned his eyes back toward the door and stepped forward, dignified, deliberate, distant. Behind him, Joseph stood near the galley, his hands clenched at his sides. He had watched it all unfold. Every slight, every forced smile, every moment of humiliation disguised as procedure. He had followed orders, upheld decorum, but now a sick weight twisted in his chest. As Elias passed him, Joseph stepped forward instinctively. "Sir," he said softly, not loud enough for the others to hear. Elias stopped, his profile sharp in the doorway's natural light. Joseph lowered his head slightly. "I didn't know. I should have seen it. I should have," he trailed off, his voice tight. "I'm sorry." There was a beat of silence. Elias regarded him with eyes that had seen more than this, more than bias and theater and small men with large egos. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Instead, he nodded once. A simple motion, but one Joseph would carry with him far longer than any words. Elias continued forward, stepping onto the tarmac where the honor guard stood at attention. The sound of boots clicking together in unison rang out across the runway. Inside the plane, passengers remained seated, as instructed. Gregory Lang stared ahead, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight. He hadn't spoken since Elias had revealed himself through silence. Unlike others who had jumped to conclusions, Gregory had known something was different. He had sensed it, but dismissed it. That made it worse. To be arrogant was one thing, to be blind while aware was another. His pride had made him cruel. His ego had made him ignorant. And now, the consequences of that ignorance sat all around him, thick as smoke. He didn't touch his drink. He didn't move. He merely watched the light filtering through the doorway where Elias had disappeared, as if hoping it would swallow his shame. Further down the aisle, a few passengers began to whisper again, this time not with scorn or mockery, but in confusion, guilt, awe. The woman in the pearl necklace exchanged a glance with her husband. He shook his head slowly, as if words were no longer appropriate. "We all saw it," she whispered. "We just didn't see him." The man didn't reply. Neither did anyone else. Madeline remained at the front, hands folded tightly, gaze locked ahead, but no longer seeing anything in front of her. She didn't follow Elias. She didn't step outside. Her body was there, but her mind was looping backward through every interaction. The boarding pass request, the demotion to economy, the ignored drink order, the deliberate collisions in the aisle. She had thought herself professional, discreet, controlled. But now she realized she had been cruel under the banner of protocol, dismissive under the illusion of order, and blind under the comfort of power. Joseph returned to the galley slowly. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't resume service. He simply leaned against the cold counter, eyes closed briefly, letting the hum of the engines dull the sound of his thoughts. The plane had landed, but something else had just taken off, something personal, irreversible, and profoundly humbling. In the aisle, one of the junior flight attendants stepped forward and asked Madeline in a hushed tone, "Should we begin disembarkation?" Madeline didn't respond immediately. Then, with a mechanical nod, she said, "Wait for clearance." Her voice sounded far away, like someone speaking from underwater. The guards outside remained at full attention. Their discipline was not for show. Their presence had not been coordinated last minute. They had been prepared all along. Only the crew had been unaware. The irony was unbearable. Everything that had happened on board had occurred under the false assumption that Elias Monroe was just another passenger. And now, the truth stood outside in military boots, under a sun that had suddenly grown far too bright for those who had chosen not to see. The sunlight pouring through the open cabin door seemed sharper now, as if it carried with it a clarity that cut through the layers of decorum, hierarchy, and pretense that had ruled the flight until now. Elias Monroe had already descended the stairs and disappeared into the formation of guards and officials waiting below. But the energy he left behind inside the aircraft refused to dissipate. It lingered in the nervous glances, the clenched jaws, the sudden awareness of every word spoken and every action taken over the past few hours. The cabin remained in eerie stillness, a kind of suspended guilt where no one dared to speak aloud what they all knew. Something had shifted permanently. Then came the sound of ascending footsteps on the stairway outside, measured, heavy, and unmistakably purposeful. 2 officers in formal attire stepped onto the aircraft, their posture crisp, their expressions unreadable. One was the same man who had greeted Elias with a salute. The other, younger but no less composed, carried a small folder tucked under his arm. They did not glance at the passengers. Their eyes went straight to the front of the cabin, where Madeline stood frozen beside the galley and Captain Harris had just emerged from the cockpit, adjusting his cuffs, clearly bracing himself for what was to come. The older officer stepped forward, voice even, tone absolute. "Captain Harris, Lead Attendant Cross," he said, nodding to each in turn. "You are hereby requested to remain aboard this aircraft for further questioning. You will be speaking with representatives from the National Security Commission." His words were direct, his phrasing careful but cold. "This pertains to your treatment of Head of State Elias Monroe while aboard this vessel." The silence that followed was total. Every passenger within earshot turned slowly, some in disbelief, others in confirmation of what they had suspected since the salute. Madeline stiffened, her professional mask cracking at the edges. "With all due respect," she began, her voice thin and brittle, "this must be a misunderstanding. I was following protocol." "I didn't know." The younger officer raised a hand to cut her off, not rudely, but with the finality of someone whose time was not to be wasted. "Ignorance of status does not excuse disregard for dignity," he said. "You'll have the opportunity to explain your actions in detail during the review." Captain Harris stepped forward then, attempting calm. "This is a civilian flight. Are we being charged with something?" "Not at this time," the officer replied, "but your compliance is expected. Your cooperation will determine how this is processed." Madeline's face flushed, not with rage, but with something deeper. She had been stripped bare by the precision of this reckoning. It wasn't loud, it wasn't vengeful, it was measured, documented, and delivered in perfect bureaucratic control. And that was somehow worse. She looked around as if hoping someone might speak up, defend her, offer context. But the passengers who had earlier laughed at her jokes or nodded along now avoided her gaze. The woman with the pearl necklace, who had once smiled politely, looked down at her lap. Joseph stood near the galley, unmoving, offering no help, no words of support. He had already spoken with his silence. The younger officer took a step forward and opened the folder, producing 2 documents. "Please review these summons," he said, handing one to Harris and one to Madeline. "You are not under arrest. However, failure to comply will be noted and may result in legal consequences under Section 42 of the Executive Protection Code." Captain Harris took the document without a word. Madeline accepted hers with shaking hands. She glanced at the passengers, then at Joseph, whose eyes met hers just long enough to communicate what she feared most, that he agreed with what was happening. She turned away. As the officers turned to exit, a third figure appeared at the doorway, a civilian aide with a communications device and earpiece. He spoke softly into his mic, paused, then nodded to someone out of sight. He took a single step onto the aircraft, looked toward the back, then turned to face the cabin. "Mr. Monroe requests that the passengers be allowed to disembark now. The security team will coordinate from here." Then he turned to go, but not before pausing as if remembering something. He stepped just slightly inside, turned toward the front of the cabin, and said he also asked me to pass along a message. At that moment, Elias reappeared, only just within view, standing at the base of the stairway, flanked by guards. The sun caught his silhouette, and for one moment, The entire cabin turned toward the light. He raised his eyes briefly, locked them on the center of the cabin, and then spoke clearly, his voice reaching every corner of the aircraft without need for amplification. "A person is not measured by the seat they occupy," he said, "but by the way they behave while sitting in it." Then, without waiting for a response, he turned once more and descended fully out of view. The silence he left behind was different from before. It wasn't just stunned, it was weighted with accountability. His words hadn't condemned, they had clarified. They hadn't called for punishment, they had redefined power. Madeline sank slowly into the jump seat behind her, shoulders drawn inward, clutching the document like a verdict she knew was earned. Captain Harris stood still, as if bracing for turbulence that hadn't yet come. Joseph exhaled slowly, quietly, his breath the only sound in the cabin. Disembarkation began. Row by row, passengers filed out, some in a hurry to escape the weight of the moment, others walking slowly, glancing back at the place where Elias had sat. No one rushed. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The aftermath unfolded not with headlines or outrage, but in the quiet, administrative movements that shape real change. The investigation proceeded methodically, with statements recorded, logs reviewed, and testimonies cross-checked against flight records and security footage. No dramatic arrests followed, no public spectacle ensued. Instead, there was consequence, deliberate, structured, undeniable. Madeline Cross was placed on immediate suspension pending review, her actions classified under breach of conduct and violation of passenger dignity guidelines. The airline's internal ethics board, previously a formality for most complaints, convened with full attendance. After 2 sessions, her removal from active flight duty was formalized. Though offered the chance to appeal, Madeline declined. She did not issue a public statement. She submitted her resignation quietly, a simple envelope placed on the desk of the regional flight director. Her signature was steady. Her posture, finally, was not defensive, but reflective. For weeks, she disappeared from the corporate circle she had once ruled. No interviews, no courtrooms, no media. But something changed. Word spread that she had begun attending workshops, not as an instructor, but as a participant, diversity sessions, conflict resolution seminars, and seminars on unconscious bias in aviation. She sat in the back, took notes, asked questions. Not everyone believed the shift. Some called it damage control. But those who sat beside her noticed the silence in her eyes and the way she listened, not to defend, but to understand. Months passed. She moved into a new role entirely, not in flight, but on the ground, the airline. Perhaps recognizing both accountability and opportunity, offered her a tentative position as a junior consultant in their new inclusion program. She accepted. Madeline did not lead the training at first. She watched others do it. She reviewed scripts, reread manuals, observed simulations. Only after completing a full cycle of internal retraining did she begin speaking again, not about herself, but about principles. When she finally stood in front of a group of new recruits, her voice was measured, humble, and free of the arrogance it once carried. "The worst thing you can do at 30,000 feet, she said, is assume you understand who someone is based on how they look or how they don't look." The recruits listened, some skeptical, others moved. But Madeline didn't seek applause. She taught because she had failed, and she understood now that failure wasn't disqualifying. Only denial was. Meanwhile, Joseph's life had shifted in quieter, but equally profound ways. His report had been included in the final investigation, and though he was not punished, he was honest in his own evaluation. He could have done more. He could have spoken sooner. And that thought stayed with him longer than any reprimand. He requested a temporary transfer from flight duty and entered the airline's internal leadership training. There, he began designing modules for new attendants, modules that didn't just cover evacuation drills or service procedures, but behavioral sensitivity, cultural literacy, and how to respond, not just professionally, but ethically, when passengers were treated unfairly. His proposal was simple. You can't control what others do, but you are always responsible for how you respond. The airline accepted the pilot version of his training. Within 3 months, it became mandatory onboarding material. Within 6 months, Joseph was promoted to program coordinator. 1 year after the flight, he stood in a tall marble lobby beneath the vaulted ceilings of an international conference hall. Flags from dozens of nations lined the corridor, and security moved with practiced subtlety through the crowd. The event was the Global Summit on Human Dignity and Mobility, a place where diplomats, airline executives, and global ethics boards gathered to discuss transportation rights and intercultural protocol. Joseph had been invited to speak on the role of behavioral accountability in flight crews. He wore a plain navy suit, a discreet tie, and carried a USB with his presentation notes, not because he needed them, but because the moment felt bigger than memory. As he finished his talk, polite applause filled the room. He stepped down from the podium, shaking hands, answering questions, when a quiet ripple of motion near the back caught his attention. A familiar figure stood by the entrance, tall, poised, composed as ever, wearing a charcoal gray suit with no lapel pin, no entourage, no spectacle. Elias Monroe. Joseph paused, took a breath, then approached. As he neared, Elias turned to face him fully, and for a second, neither man spoke. Joseph extended a hand. "Mr. President," he said. Elias took it with a firm but unhurried grip. "Mr. Layton," he replied, voice calm and warm. "I hear you've been busy." Joseph offered a modest smile. "Trying to do better than last time." Elias nodded slowly. "That's all anyone can ask." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the soft murmur of conversation and the rustle of conference programs. Joseph glanced sideways, then back at Elias. "I've changed a lot since that flight," he said quietly, "but I still think about it. What I did, what I didn't do." Elias didn't correct him. He didn't comfort him either. Instead, he offered something more lasting. "Mistakes don't define you," he said, "but how you respond to them, how you grow from them, does." Joseph exhaled, not as an apology, but as release. He nodded once, then stepped back respectfully. Elias turned, his gaze passing over the crowd as if measuring the world without judgment, but with clarity. Then, with a parting look, he moved down the corridor and vanished into the flow of dignitaries and delegates. The conference continued. Speeches resumed. But for Joseph, the moment lingered like sunlight on the skin after stepping out of shadow. It wasn't closure. It was continuation, the kind that doesn't erase the past, but builds something new atop it. If this story moved you, consider liking and subscribing to support more powerful narratives like this one. What part of Elias's journey surprised you the most? Was there a moment that made you pause or reflect? Let us know in the comments, especially where you're watching from. Your voice adds depth to the story.